and go to movement and permitting. And I'm going to let Dr. Smart talk about this piece of the response as well. Thank you. Advance my slide and I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Smart.
Okay. So this is kind of a good transition in talking about biosecurity, moving into permitted movement, and some testing as well. So far we've kind of focused on what it looks like to be that index or that infected farm, but all of the other commercial farms that fall into the infected and the buffer zone, which together is the control area, anything that moves in there has to be permitted because everything in that control area is technically under quarantine. And so I'll get into a little bit more of the permitting, but this is kind of a good example to demonstrate when we might have to permit a movement. So we have the infected zone in red and the buffer zone. Again, together, that's the control area. So everything in there is under quarantine. And all of those red dots are an example of commercial farms that are in there. So those would not be able to move birds or eggs without a permit, but it would not be uncommon to potentially have a hatchery that's in a control area. So if they needed to move eggs or birds, that would be permitted. But then your feed mill, technically, it's outside of that control zone. It's in that surveillance area, which is the free area, but they more than likely would be providing feed to a lot of the farms in that control area. And so all of those movements would have to be permitted. And again, maybe a processing plant that's nearby, it doesn't necessarily fall in that control zone, but there are a lot of movements that have to take place for continuity of business, and those would have to be permitted as well. So even though a feed mill, a processing plant, or something might technically fall outside of that control area, they would need to provide or be able to demonstrate an enhanced biosecurity plan in order for us to permit those movements. Next slide, please. Okay, so talk a little bit about EMERS. So this is the Emergency Management Response System, and this is the database that it's a federal database that we use for HPAI and other foreign animal disease response. It's what we use on the state and federal side to document things, keep track of the response, but it's also the system that we use for permitting movements. And there is a way for producers or companies to gain access to what's called the EMERS Gateway. So you don't get access to the entire database, but you essentially can have access to a portal system that's specifically for doing permitting, so requesting those permits. Next slide, please. So the first step that we would want individuals to take would be to get e-auth or e-authentication access. So that's how you get access to the EMERS database. And so I think it would be really important to sort of ahead of time pre-identify, at least one, probably ideally two people, at least for the company or maybe for specific premises or maybe a group or a region of premises to be that point of contact. And so that's the person that you would want to get e-auth access, and they would be the person putting in all of these permit requests. You We can get e-auth access set up ahead of time, but you would not need the EMERS gateway access until the actual control area is established. So you can essentially be pre-approved to have access to the system, but we wouldn't necessarily give you that access until we actually have a control area and we know we're going to be needing to do permitted movements. And so that person that you would identify to be that sort of EMERS permitting point person They would need to have knowledge about all potential movements, knowing the regular and upcoming schedule of movements, someone who has really good knowledge of testing requirements and the results, someone who can update test results into the system, because that's an important part of permitting, and be able to make the request. So it tends to work better to have someone with a lot of that sort of intimate on the ground knowledge, not necessarily one person for um, the whole company, but maybe for each complex, just someone who can really be on top of expected movements. And it also helps us on the state and federal response side. If we have questions or we're needing to clarify things on permits, we're not trying to track down a whole bunch of people. We can keep really good or efficient communication. Next slide. So this slide just kind of talks generally about the requirements for both permitted movement and interstate movement. Because a lot of times things are moving out of a control zone just to another place within the state, but they can move out of state. And a lot of times we will also get requests from other states to move birds or eggs or things like that into the state. So it is a case by case basis. We are evaluating sort of the risks. This is when, that at the initial detection, we're doing a lot of that epidemiological work because we are trying to very quickly establish, who's an infected premises, who's a contact premises, or maybe an at-risk premise. Because pretty quickly we know there's going to be movement requests, but we have to kind of know who are we going to allow to move things, who's going to be the biggest risk for potential disease spread if we allow the movement of various poultry products. So we try to get that information as quickly as possible, but it can take time, especially in that first couple of days in a detection for HPAI. So there is always a chance that approving some movements may be a little bit delayed, and that's just because we're trying to identify where farms are located and how risky is it for them to move things, how closely are they connected to that infected farm. Traceability information is very important, so this is why we would require you to have a premises identification number or a PIN number, which we talked about a little bit before. And we upload all of that information again into the EMER system so that we can track those movements, and it helps us sort of map where the different movements are taking place. Of course, we would want to know that the flock that's requesting to move something is healthy, so they have normal parameters, and those are described individually in the secure food supply, depending on the type of facility that you are. Following specific biosecurity procedures. That would include trucks and drivers, as well as the product-specific biosecurity. So if you go to the secure poultry supply, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but they have a bunch of different guidance documents specifically for different types of movements and different types of products. So whether it's eggs, whether it's broilers, meat birds, or day-old chicks, there's different types of guidance or biosecurity protocols that we would want to make sure are being followed. And then just making sure, again, that that premises that's wanting to move something is not infected or potentially a contact premises. So apart from doing that initial contact tracing and epidemiology we do at the beginning of an outbreak, there's also some questionnaires that have to be filled out throughout the process, as well as every time we're permitting movements, just to make sure that you can continue to demonstrate that, your farm is not at risk for potentially being an infected premises. And this especially comes into play when we're talking about moving between states, because the destination state, if you're sending eggs or birds to another state, they ultimately have to approve that permit. So they will want to really know that you're following all of these surveillance and biosecurity guidelines. Next slide. And so here's the link to that secure poultry supply. I would highly recommend you visit this. It's a very good website. It really lays it out pretty clearly on permit guidance. This is what we're going to be using to make sure that you're following all of the different guidance requirements. And so there are different templates specific to the product. So they'll have it for eggs, egg byproducts, day-old birds, and then live birds, and they go into, if it's a pullet movement, if it's a broiler to slaughter, or if it's a spent hen to slaughter, there's all the different types of guidance. And so that's what we would go through and make sure that you're following when you do a permit request, and make sure essentially that that's being done before we would approve that permit. Next slide. And so here's an example pulled straight from that website. So this is an example of if someone was wanting to move broilers to a slaughter facility. And so you can see here below, it has all the different permit guidance. So these are the things that we would have to make sure are being done before approving that permit. So again, making sure that your premises is what's considered a monitored premises, essentially saying that you're not infected and you're not contact, or you're not an at-risk premises. We may have to put in place a pre-movement isolation period. A lot of times this is specified as a 5-day period. This can change depending on where we are in the outbreak. And this is basically to say that for a certain number of days before the movement takes place, you're following the enhanced biosecurity. You don't have any unnecessary people coming on and off. It's a sort of showing that you're doing a little bit of an isolation before that movement's going to take place. Again, following the product specific biosecurity. So whether that's eggs, broilers, day-old chicks, this one is specific for broilers. So this is just a snapshot of the guidance. If you were to pull this document from the website, it would be much longer. You could go down and see all the specific outlined biosecurity things you're supposed to do specifically for broilers. We would also want to make sure that the route of transportation is acceptable. It's not going to be putting other facilities or premises at risk. You would also need to demonstrate specifically how you're going to do biosecurity for the loadout and live haul. And then, of course, testing. So there will always have to be some sort of testing done, either 24 hours or 24 and 48 hours before that move. Next slide. So talking a little bit more about the specific testing requirements. So you would still need to do the minimum of 2 11-bird pools per house. Again, focusing on sick or dead birds. And then if you didn't have 22 dead birds to sample, at least trying to do as many that you can get. And you can, because you have to do 2 pools, so 2 11-bird pools per house, you can either do both of those 24 hours before the movement, or you can do one pool at 24 hours, or one at 48 hours, and the second pool at 48 hours, or 48 and 24. And that's just dependent on the company or the farm, whatever works best for you to collect those samples. But it's very important to document when those samples are taken, because we have to follow that 24-hour or 48-hour guideline very strictly. And if your loadout is going to take more than 24 hours, potentially if it takes, the course of a couple of days to load everything out, you're going to have to be continuing to doing that sampling to make sure that there has been a test done no more than 24 hours before they actually load out and leave the farm. So that's just something to think about when you're doing a permit request. How much time is it going to take? How much sampling are you going to have to do? Because it might need to be a very detailed schedule to make sure we're following all of the testing requirements. Next slide. And just kind of going over, I guess, the definition of a permitted movement. So it's really anything that's going into, out of, or within a control area. Each movement can be permitted, or we can do a single permit for multiple movements if it's going to be the same type of movement, so the same product, and going from between the same two places. So for example, for feed delivery, or maybe you're gonna do or you're gonna move some eggs, but it's gonna take several different loads, but it's going from between the same two places. We could do one permit for that movement, but you would still document every single individual movement. And that would all get tracked in the EMERS database. And that just helps us keep track of everything. Again, why it's so important to have that person designated to oversee it on the company or the farm side, because they would need to be updating that fairly frequently, almost in real time for all of those movements. And again, so the state of origin initially reviews and accepts a permit request, but if it's going to another state, they have to ultimately approve it. So there is always a chance that you may want to move something out of a control zone into another state, and that state veterinarian may say no. So there needs to be some discussion beforehand on movements, because we don't want a permit request to come in just the day before or within 24 hours and then find out that they can't actually move, and we have to sort of scramble and find something. So a lot of good communication between both states if things are moving between different states. Next slide. And this is a pretty good summary of the overall permitting process. So initially, the producer or someone from the company, whoever has that EOF account, is putting in that permit request. It could be someone on the state or federal team, but typically we have the company or the producer put in that request. Then the origin state can go into the EMERS database system, sort of initially accept it, and then that creates a pending permit. And then the incident management team and the origin state would review that, look for any supplemental documentation that might be required. Typically, that would be a biosecurity plan and test results. Then they can review that and accept it. If it's going to another state, that reviewed permit goes to that state. They have to do a final review and actually approve the permit. Again, they may deny it, and they would deny it and notify us that they have decided not to take that product. But if it's just moving in state, it would be the same team that's reviewing it and would do the final approval. And then that's when you would be issued the approved permit. And that would, again, all be in the EMERS database. And again, if there's going to be multiple movements on one permit, there would be one permit document that you would have, but you would go in and put in every single movement that happens under that. So every single feed delivery, as long as it fits under that permit. Next slide. So I'm not going to go too in depth on these next couple of slides. It's more for your reference, and these are just pulled straight from the USDA website. But it essentially outlines the different types of products or things that might be moved and what would be required to move them. The most common things that we do are just poultry, so live birds and eggs. Again, if it's coming from an infected premises, suspect or contact, that movement's going to be or won't be allowed, but it can be moved under a permit. Some things, just depending on the risk, where they are, we may require a permit to move it. For example, sometimes we've required that for manure or litter if they're coming from an infected farm. If it's a pretty low risk, like clean litter that's being moved, we may not require a permit, but request that we do review a biosecurity plan. So this just kind of outlines all the different types of movements that may be taking place. But for the most part, feed, manure, and especially live birds and eggs, if they are moving anywhere inside or out of a control area, we're going to require a permit to move that. You can go to the next slide. Okay. And just sort of a reminder of why we do this, why it's important to permit some of these movements. So the risks of moving something in a control zone without a permit is potentially inadvertent disease transmission to other premises in the area. It can threaten our goals of controlling and containment as well as eradication efforts. And if something does get moved without a permit, it can be punishable by state regulations. Quarantine and movement requirements do fall to the state veterinarian. So that's why at any given time, the state vet does have authority to either accept or deny a movement from an area that's under quarantine. So just kind of being familiar with some of these regulations and the requirements of permitted movement is really important because overall, we're just trying to reduce any risk of disease spread during an outbreak. Next slide. Okay, that's all for permitted movement. Um, Kind of like everything today, this is probably more of a broad view just to sort of review the major components. It can get very detailed, but that secure poultry website has a lot of good information on permitted movement guidance. And of course, if you have more specific questions about it, just feel free to reach out. I did a lot of the permitting this past year, so that I would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have about that.